Hi class, this is Professor Harmony Kim. Today you will study the social condition of the Buddha's day. In order to understand Theravada history, we will figure out the social condition in terms of use of money, use of writing, what kind of trade going on, agricultural potential, etc. The Buddha was born in Kapilavatu. Kapilavatu is a town in what is now the Nepalese Tere. And the Buddha spent his life in what is now Bihar and eastern Uttar Pradesh. The word Bihar is the same as Vihara. Vihara means the Buddhist word for monastery. Though this area is now intersected by the international boundary between India and Nepal, it is a geographical unit, the Middle Gangetic Plain. The Buddha's birthplace is sufficiently far from where the Vedic civilization can have penetrated at all. Also, it is even possible that the Buddha's mother tongue was not an Indo-Aryan language. When the Buddha walked southeast into central Bihar, he encountered Brahminical culture who had not been brought up to take up its prepositions for granted. The Buddha came from a community called Shaka. Hence, his commonist Sanskrit title Shakyamuni, the sage of the Shaka. He modeled the organization of his Sangha on that of such a community as his own. The Shakas seems not to have had a caste system, but they did have servants. They were isolated to the extent that they were self-governing, and their polity was of a form not emphasized in Brahminical theory. This polity presented the Buddha with a model of how a casteless society could function. In the Sangha, he instituted no principle of rank, but seniority, and this seniority can be counted in that case from ordination. In caste system, groups of men who exercise political power could only be of the Kshatriya class. The Buddha described himself as a Kshatriya when he met caste-proud Brahmins. By ideology, Kshatriya ranks second beneath the Brahmin. But he is the man with the real physical power. Even the Brahmin depends on Kshatriya for his safety and physical welfare. The relations between Brahmin and Kshatriya have always been somewhat ambiguous because their power relations depend entirely on your point of view. From the early Upanishad, the kings are shown lording it over Brahmins and even teaching them doctrines. It hardly seems a coincidence that the Buddha and Mahavira challenging everything the Brahmins stood for. The Buddha and Mahavira both claimed Kshatriya status. and they are two greatest religious leaders of the period. What were the material conditions of the society in which the Buddha preached? And in which area the Buddha spent most of his time? The Buddha spent much of his time in cities. Max Weber begins his account of Buddhism with these words, like Jainism, but even more clearly, Buddhism presents itself as the product of the time of urban development, of urban kingship, and the city nobles. The Buddha talked to kings, such as King Pasenadi of Kosala, King Bimbisara, and his son Ajatasattu of Magadha, and they ruled quite sizable territories from their urban capitals. Thus, the Buddha's period saw not only urbanization, but also the beginnings of what one might call states. The period also saw the first use of money and the beginnings of organized trade. Both urbanization and trade can only arise when there is an agricultural surplus. As the center of civilization moved down the Ganges, it came to an area of higher rainfall and hence greater agricultural potential. The area was fertile ground for rice. On the other hand, the more rich vegetation may have been harder to clear than the scrub jungle for the northwest. D.D. Kosambi argued that the agricultural surplus was made possible by the use of iron plow shares and other tools. Kosambi said these came from the rich iron deposit in South Bihar. At the same time, smelting techniques might have advanced to produce harder iron. There are indeed a few references to iron tools in text of the period, though they cannot be very precisely dated and give no clue to the prevalence or quality of the iron. The problem is the lack of archaeological evidence. R.S. Sharma, who is a historian who also supports Kosambi's thesis, writes like this. Literary references are not matched by archaeological discoveries of the tools belonging to the age of the Buddha. In eastern Up and Bihar, there is evidence for the use of iron from 700 BC onwards, but so far no plowshare has been discovered and iron tools for agriculture are not found in good numbers. Nevertheless, this can be explained by ecological reasons. The acid, humid, warm soil of eastern Up and Bihar has proved to be highly corrosive. There also does not seem to have been great improvement in the quality of the iron used. Later, when steel came into use, it proved more lasting and serviceable. But in 600 to 300 BC, most iron objects belong to the wrought category. Even still recent times in Bihar, plowshares were made of semi-steel. After a few years' use, they get heavily rusted. It may indeed be that we find so few iron tools of the period because they have all rusted away. But this does not make iron a pliable foundation on which to build a whole theory of cultural change. A. Gosh points out that urbanization can occur without any iron. For example, the Egyptian without iron can cut granite blocks and build fortified cities. The cities of Central America arose in a civilization which has no plow, no stock breeding, no sailing boats, and no wheeled transport, let alone iron. In India, the Harappan civilization produced cities without using iron tools. Jungle can be cleared by burning, though Sharma objects that one still has to dig out the stump. That is not impossible with, for example, Cooper Brown's tools. Sharma suggests that transplantation, which greatly increased yield, began in the Buddha's day. But unfortunately, this is a guess. Transplantation is described in Jain text, which may have existed before the 3rd century BC. It is hardly convincing evidence for the Buddha's day. On the other hand, the techniques may have been in use much earlier than the Buddha. Sharma summarized like this. In eastern India, rice was undoubtedly produced before 1200 BC, around 1000 BC. We get wet rice grains. It has been claimed that cultivated rice appeared in the Vindhyan region near Allahabad in the Neolithic phase around 5000 BC. In any case, about 7000 BC, we get charred rice grains from Sonphor in central Bihar. We do not know whether the cultivators used transplantation, but there is no doubt about the use of rice in this part of the country before its large-scale colonization since 600 BC. The failure of archaeology to support the view that the new wealth must have derived from technical advance goes beyond the problems of iron and rice transplantation. Sharma quotes, "It is argued that before 300 BC, no visible changes in the material life of the people can be detected on the basis of archaeological excavation." In a way, it is correct because till 300 BC, we do not find burnt bricks, ring wells, profuse shirt, numerous terracottas and coins, and too many iron agricultural tools. But what is more crucial for the understanding of the material life of the age of the Buddha is the very cropping up of a large number of settlements in the aluminum belt of the middle Gangetic basin. The main reason for the production of a surplus was probably not a technical discovery, but simply the spread of a population into a region with better ecological conditions for agriculture. Towns and cities arise primarily as settlements of people whose main livelihood is not derived directly from agriculture. They are political and commercial centers. There can be no trade without an economic surplus. But though trade seems to be a necessary condition for the creation of towns, it is not a sufficient one. On the other hand, it is too easily forgotten that commerce itself depends on organization. What kind of organization? An infrastructure of communications and a certain level of legality and security. Both produces of stable political conditions. It is kings who construct the road along which vehicles can move and allow for land trade in large quantities than a peddler carries on his back. In the countryside of Bihar and neighboring areas, large-scale trade is impossible without the security provided by the towns. The earliest coins found are dated to the late 6th century BCE, and they were widely used by the end of the 5th century BCE. These early coins are all punch-marked, not inscribed. They have a high silver content, which must have come from outside the region, but not all historians agree with that it must have come from outside India. It is unlikely that there was extensive foreign trade going on. In other words, some Buddhist texts talk about sea trade, but they are not among the earliest ones. The fact that an early Brahminical law book prohibits going to sea betrays the possibility, but this text also is probably a bit later. Does trade on such a scale depend on literacy? There is no evidence for writing in the Buddha's day. There are 3 references to writing in the Vinaya Pitaka, and Vinaya Pitaka is the text generally thought to date from the 1st century in their present form. In other words, there is one extremely doubtful reference in an older text. No examples of writing survive from before the 3rd century. Ghosh thinks that as Asoka's inscriptions use the same script over most of India, it would be reasonable to allow 1 or 2 centuries for a standardization. Thus, although Romila Thapa states that writing was used in the Buddha's day, there is no evidence to support that. If it exists at all, we can be sure that its use was very limited, perhaps to accounting. Certainly, there were no books. At this time, and for several centuries more, scriptures had to be preserved orally. The archaeological evidence for cities at this time is astonishingly meager, because building was in wood and mud. No public monument or public building which could go back to the time of the Buddha has been found, with the possible exception of a palace at Kosambi. No evidence has been found of city planning or public drainage till as late as the 2nd century BCE. The earliest date it seems reasonable to assign to an Indian city is 600 BCE. Those are both Kosambi and Ujjain may be that old. Kosambi and Ujjain are only 2 of the square or so of towns mentioned in the Buddhist canon. The Pali sources have the Buddha spending most of his time at Rajagaha, Vesali, and Savatthi, and all these towns continued to be prominent in Buddhist history. A text in the Digha Nikaya, Volume 2, 6 great cities are listed. Those are Kampa, Rajagaha, Savatthi, Saketa, Kosambi, and Benares. Benares is the same of Varanasi. Except Saketa, all these 6 cities were capitals of what the text called large countries. In early Indian history, twice the size of kingdoms made critical increase, almost quantum leaps. And this greatly affected Buddhist history. The first critical leap was the establishment of large countries. The second was the creation of the Maorian Empire 2 or 3 centuries later. At both junctures, the larger unit rarely destroyed the smaller, but rather subsumed it, feeding it into an overarching structure. The power required to control the larger structure was no doubt initially acquired by force, but its retention must have depended also on an increasingly efficient and complex apparatus of government control. There arose 2 major new professions. They are both presumably urban-based. They are state officials and traders. The former, such as state officials, must have been much the smaller, and we do not know how it originally related to the caste system. Caste system never acknowledged it. With the increasing use of writing, bureaucrats have tended to be Brahmins. The earliest form of the caste ideology does not have a place for trade. Trade come to be assigned to the Vaishya. But in the Buddha's day, the dominant strata of urban society were not catered for by Brahminism. Gautama says that some prohibit Vedic recitation in a city. Budayana, dated from 500 to 200 BCE, puts it more graphically that the city dweller should attain salvation is an impossibility. The countless particularistic rules of Brahmin orthodoxy were formulated for village society. There is some evidence that the Buddha's message appealed especially to town dwellers and the new social classes. This evidence resulted from the analysis of the social composition of the early Sangha. And the analysis is based on 2 canonical collections of religion poems, that is, the Theravada and Theravada. Theravada are ascribed to monks, and Theravada are ascribed to nuns. We have plausible information on a sample of over 300 monks and nuns. More than 2/3 of them came from large towns, and of these 2/3, 86% from just 4 cities, such as Savatthi, Rajagaha, Kapilavatu, and Vesali. As for the caste of 328 religious, 134, approximately 40%, were Brahmin, 75 Kshatriya, 98 Vaishya, and 11 Sudra, 10 were outcast. Nearly half of them came from wealthy or powerful houses. Thus, the Brahmin recruits were not the traditional village priest, but rather upper-class urbanities. According to the figure, they show that Buddhism was not primarily a religion treated badly by people in power. The canonical text also gives us an idea of the social composition of the Buddha's lay support. The term which constantly recurs is Kahapati. Kahapati literally means master of a house, namely householder. The canonical Kahapati is the head of a respectable family, not necessarily Brahmin, unless specifically said to be so. Who were these people in terms of class or profession? In the canon, most of them evidently own land, but they usually have laborers to do the physical work. Sometimes they are also in business. In fact, they illustrate how it is in the first instance wealth derived from agriculture, which provides business capital. The average Kahapati who gave material support to the Buddha and his Sangha seems to have been something like a gentleman farmer. Perhaps these farmers have townhouse. On the other hand, inscriptions in the Western Deccan. Western Deccan is the place Buddhism flourished in the early century CE. The inscriptions in the Western Deccan use the term Kahapati to refer to urban merchant. We must distinguish between reference and meaning. The meaning of Kahapati is simple and unvarying, but the reference shifts with the social context. By the time of the Buddha, there was already a whole milieu of renouncers, a kind of counterculture with which Brahminical ideology was struggling to come to terms. One ancient religion from the ascetic milieu, Jainism, survived to this day. In Jainism, all karma is undesirable. Thus, they arrive at the radical conclusion that the best course is to do nothing at all. The best solution is to remain motionless and starve to death. The Jain renouncers still go completely naked after plucking their hair out by the root to symbolize their rejection of all social roles. They may only eat wheat and from their hands and only once a day. Sometimes at other times not even water may be ingested. They may not wash or clean their teeth. They carry homelessness to the point of being more or less constantly on the move. In other words, they normally do not spend 2 nights in the same place. Thus, the path to salvation seems to have been conceived primarily as one of mortification, not meditation. What impels people to undertake such frightful austerities? What were the peculiar problems caused by the social changes outlined above? Rapid social change tends to upset people. This is no doubt true. Professor Ghosh has provided a more precise and interesting summary of how urbanization may engender a spiritual malaise. For example, the movement from village to town to city entails a more complex division of labor and professional specialization. Also, urbanization can cause social organization less in terms of kinship group and more in terms of goal-oriented associations. Less stringent control over the individual and greater dependence on impersonal institutions of control. Greater individual freedom and mobility, and hence some disintegration of the traditional culture and social order. We may add that these factors operate more rapidly as one climbs the social scale. We know too little about the Buddha's social environment to apply every factor Professor Ghosh has listed to that time, but the general picture is familiar. In other words, a move away from the closed community towards a more open society, an increase in the individual's power to choose, and hence a doubt about choosing rightly. As the center of civilization moved down the Ganges, it encountered a warmer, wetter climate. Hence flourished many parasite-carrying diseases to mankind. McNeill described like this: today, the Ganges region sustains cholera, malaria, and dengue fever. Dengue fever means dengue virus, together with a great variety of multicelled parasites, as well as the more universal disease of cities and civilization that are familiar in cooler climes. What disease organism may have circulated in ancient times cannot be said for sure, but the climate of the Ganges Valley certainly must have permitted a rich array of parasites to arise as soon as dense populations came into existence. Diseases were endemic here which were absent from the northwest of India, where the Indo-Aryans had first settlers. Therefore, they must have afflicted the newcomers who had built up no resistance to them, and so slow the pace of advance. The growth of towns in the Gangetic Basin show that the worst initial obstacles had been overcome. However, we can be sure that concentration of a population heightened disease incidence and indeed mortality, for this consequence has everywhere followed urbanization. This is both because of the hygienic problem that arises, notably that it is hard to get uncontaminated water, and because concentrations of a population sustain disease-bearing parasites which die out where hosts are few. In the long run, these parasites become endemic. Resistance develops by natural selection, and the disease become childhood afflictions from which most parents recover. But this balance takes several generations to develop, and at first, mortality is bound to be much higher than in the surrounding countryside. This connection between cities and morbidity was not unknown to ancient India. Maybe it is no accident that the early Buddhists were fond of medical metaphor describing the Buddha as the great physician. It has even been surmised that the very format of the first sermon and its Four Noble Truths follows a medical model, such as diagnosing the complaint, finding its cause, finding what would eliminate the cause, prescribing the medicine to achieve that elimination. Today, in order to understand Theravada history, Theravadian tradition in terms of social conditions was studied. Quiz 1. What is the ultimate goal of Buddhism as a religion? Just attaining nirvana? Cultivating compassion? I already explained the ultimate goal of a religion in this lecture. Quiz 2. There was a brief writing during the Buddha's days. True or false? You need to submit quiz answer to my email address. Here's my email address. Include your email address in CC and subject title. You have to write down course code BUD 413. BUD 413. Without course code, you might lose your attendance. So BUD 413 and date January 10 assignment. And please use main text body of email. Do not make attachment file. The content you have to send to me is not a lot. Just writing your official name, starting last name, comma, followed by first name. Then you add quiz answer. That's it. Since the content of email is not many, therefore you don't have to produce attachment file. The due of this assignment is January 23rd, Sunday, because next Monday is official holiday. This is the end of lecture video.